Hi, this is Pastor Josh from First Baptist of Queen. Thank you for joining us on our Wednesday night study, a verse-by-verse walkthrough of the entire Old Testament. Tonight we're starting in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 9. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Millo inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. Now first, as we get into this passage, let's look at a diagram of the city. So you see here, David, he sought to shore up the defenses so that no one else would be able to come into the city through a similar weakness as he had exploited. Down there to the right of the city, there is the tower that David and his men came into the city through, up the water, through the waterway. And the Millo there is that kind of, I guess, what is that, the south wall. He extended out to cover the section that they got in on so nobody else could do what they did. And so if you look too, Jerusalem doesn't appear to be that big, at least at that point. David, what he is going to do is expand the city dramatically through his reign as king. You can see there in the back, there's a little hill back there, and it's actually labeled on the map. That little hill back there was where a man named Araunah the Jebusite lived. He was, David, when he took over the city, did not kick out all of the Jebusites. Some stayed and were incredibly loyal to David. And Araunah lived on that hill back there. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, when David had sinned and taken a census rather than trust the Lord, and God gave him options of judgment, and angel of death came, and David looked out his window and saw the angel of death coming towards Jerusalem, and the angel stopped on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite out on that hill. And that hill ended up, or what is traditionally believed by Jews, to be where Abraham sought to offer Isaac to the Lord, and it also became where the temple would be built. Right back there. So the city of Jerusalem expanded that much to encompass all of that area as well. And so this is kind of where David was building out the city, forward to the side, backward, to make the stronghold even larger, or to make the city a stronger stronghold than it already was. So look back at verse 9 again. David living there, calling the city of David, he becomes greater and greater. David gave the city a nickname after himself, after his men had snuck in and taken it. Then we're given this profound note about the increase of David's supposed greatness. We're not told whether David's greatness was in the amount of property attained, he had great property, or his greatness was in the eyes of the people of Israel, or in the eyes of the nations surrounding Israel, or inherently within himself, or simply as God enabled the greatness to develop. Even though the context for his greatness is not defined for us, the author wants to make sure that we understand that his greatness was not generated on his own. David was not great within himself. Even his battle skill and strategy, though exceptional, were not enough to make him great on their own, most likely because they did not come from within him alone. David's greatness as a warrior, as a commander, as a leader, and as a prince over the people was entirely the result of the Lord's presence with him. And even still, the Lord's presence with David did not guarantee success. Saul also had the Lord's presence with him, at least at the beginning. But what Saul neglected, David prioritized, resulting in the growth of his greatness. And David willingly submitted to the Lord's influential guidance through the Lord's Spirit. And this is still the same for any of us today who believe in Jesus. Submission to the guiding influence of the Lord's Holy Spirit will result in an individually unachievable greatness that can only be from Him. Look at verse 11. And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees also, carpenters and masons who built David a house. And David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. Now, Tyre was a city within the larger region of Lebanon, and the cedar trees of Lebanon were legendary during the ancient times. Hiram undoubtedly wanted to establish a good relationship with the new and very powerful king of Israel, so Tyre supplied all of the structural lumber and all of the knowledgeable craftsmen necessary to build this magnificent palace for David. Tyre, the city, was about 100 miles away from Jerusalem. Tyre does the same thing for David's son later when he succeeds his father. And Tyre supplies the necessary lumber from the cedars of Lebanon for the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. And this kind of thing is still done today. Manufacturers will send gifts and samples to people of influence in hopes of establishing a good relationship for substantial future business. Or maybe Tyre also, wanted to receive back agriculture from Israel. Tyre is actually mentioned throughout it's mentioned all throughout ancient texts from many of the ancient cultures from this part of the world. So they must have been a very well-equipped supplier for a great many people. Take a look at this. This is a carving that is included in a report in Assyria about 100 years before David. And this carving depicts cedar logs from Lebanon being floated down a river to be delivered to the Assyrian king. So it wasn't just Israel that received this. This distribution of cedar from Tyre happened all over the place to all kinds of kingdoms. Look at verse 13. And David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. And these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem: Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet. Now Solomon will become king after David. And what's interesting is, a few chapters ago, we see some other kids that had been born to David is that Solomon becoming king. Solomon was the 10th son born to David. And Solomon, he is listed in Matthew chapter 1 as the ancestor of Jesus through Mary. But Solomon's brother Nathan, right there on that list, he's listed in Luke chapter 3 as the legally adopted, not biological, ancestor of Jesus through Joseph. What's interesting too about that is in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 5, we see a list that both Solomon and Nathan are sons of Bathsheba. That God chose Bathsheba to be the one through whom the line of Jesus would come. But as we saw before, Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, expressly forbade the king of Israel from taking many wives. Maybe David had a different view of the word many. He takes significantly more women than did Saul. Saul only had one recorded wife and one recorded concubine, but he does not have even a slight fraction of wives and concubines compared to his son Solomon. And yet, this decision to take these many wives and these many concubines will lead to some very great problems for himself and for his children. Anytime we attempt to find a loophole in God's plan or God's word in an effort to justify ourselves, we are really attempting to find God's endorsement for our sin. And God will never endorse sin. He condemns sin. He forgives sin if we turn to Jesus, but God will never say that anti-God behavior is okay. Copying the customs and practices of the unbelieving world around us will only ever lead to problems and disruptions to the Lord's plans for us. Verse 17, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, and all the Philistines went up to search for David. But David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. Now, the last interaction that the Philistines had with David, he had been living among them. He had been considered to be a close personal friend of one of their own kings. And even though some of the Philistine leaders had not trusted David to go to battle alongside them, they may have yet considered him to be some sort of ally. And now word gets back to the Philistines that David, who had been gifted a Philistine city, has become the anointed king of their sworn enemy, Israel. We are not told, but I do wonder what Achish, the king of Gath, had thought when he heard that his friend David had become the king of his enemy. He had considered David to be loyal to him because King Saul had been trying to kill him. But now David had become king, not by killing the previous king. Actually, the Philistines had killed the previous king, and the people had gathered together and publicly endorsed David as their king. Achish may have felt personally betrayed or in complete disbelief that his friend David had returned to the enemy of the Philistines and become their king. Maybe the Philistines had not objected when David was reigning over one tribe of Israel from Hebron. After all, it was not the entire nation. It was towards the south, and it was away from the Philistines. But then news reached them of the conquering of Jerusalem and David moving his capital of operations there. And the Philistines would have had a problem with this because Jerusalem was centrally located. The closest Philistine city of Gath was only a few miles from Jerusalem, while the southernmost city of Gaza had been 40 miles from Hebron. In addition, Hebron was 2,000 feet in elevation higher than Gaza. So the distance would have been much more difficult to traverse between those two cities. But now David has had the entire nation of Israel rally around him, and he has relocated the central city of his government only a few miles away from Philistia. So naturally, the Philistines were extremely concerned about David's ascension. They call up all of the armies of all of their cities to go out and try to wipe out David's new rule. And if you think about it, the Philistines would have been very familiar with David's ability to fight in battle, as he had fought them many times under the instruction of King Saul. So they gather seemingly every available troop that they can find throughout their country. David then gets word of their troop movements toward Israel, and he heads down to the stronghold. We're not told the exact location of this stronghold. There may have been several places throughout Israel that were secure, hard to attack locations. Yeah, there was a cave of Adullam as a stronghold in 1 Samuel 22, where David went after taking his parents to live in Moab. There were multiple strongholds mentioned in 1 Samuel 23:14, of which David is said to have used when successfully hiding from Saul. But there has been discovered another fortress in what will be included in the expanded walls of Jerusalem. It is called the Fortress of Zion, or the Stronghold of Zion, referenced in this same chapter back in verses 7 and 9. And this could serve almost as a kind of bunker were David ever to be attacked while he was in Jerusalem. It's even suggested by some that David ends up building his palace above this stronghold so that he can descend into it were the city to be besieged. It's possibly to one of those other strongholds, or highly likely this stronghold in Jerusalem, that David retreats as he had done previously. Verse 18. Now, the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand?" And the Lord said to David, "Go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand." Now, the valley of Rephaim was only about 1 to 4 miles to the southwest of Jerusalem. So the mustering of the entire Philistine army in the very backyard of David could have been quite unnerving to the people of Jerusalem. Maybe the Philistines assumed that David still went out to fight with his small band of 600 fighters rather than the whole Israelite army. So maybe they thought that they could simply overwhelm him with far superior numbers. But David's skill in battle was not all that surpassed all other leaders, because he knew that his personal skill in battle was not the ultimate determining factor for victory. So he proceeded to do what was his natural inclination at this point in his reign. David sought to ask the Lord whether or not he should go out against the Philistines, and if he would be victorious were he to go out. Again, this activity of seeking the Lord was not something that the previous king had made a regular habit of his time while he was king. David was setting himself apart from the decisions and behavior of Saul through each of his own actions. Notice that David's inquiry of the Lord is actually two separate questions. So by asking two separate questions, it would seem that David's actions do not hinge on an affirmative answer to both of them. Asking two questions seems to imply that David would be perfectly willing to go to battle for the Lord, even if the Lord were to answer affirmatively to the first question and negatively to the second question. If the Lord wanted David to go into battle, but still told him that he would lose the battle, then David seems willing to embrace that outcome. But his willingness to fight what he knew would be a losing battle would not be tested on this day, because the Lord tells David that he is both to go and fight and that he will, in actuality, be victorious against the Philistines. And of course, knowing the outcome of a battle being in your favor would make anyone far more confident that they might have been otherwise, though it would seem that David's confidence in battle always came from the Lord anyway. Verse 20. And David came to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there, and he said, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breaking flood. Therefore, the name of that place is called Baal Perazim. And the Philistines left their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. Now, the specifics of this plan are unknown, of this place, Baal Perazim. The specifics are unknown to us today, though it is named, it seems to have only been named by David after the battle had taken place. So it's possibly just some random place that didn't have a name before this. We're also not told how many men David took with him out to battle against the Philistines. Previously, we had been told about David taking his men, meaning his 600 men, and we will be told later about the army of Israel. But here, the author of 2 Samuel does not tell us who all went to fight alongside David, though we're told of his men after the fight. I think we can safely assume that David did not fight the battle single-handedly with the Lord, though undoubtedly defeating the Philistines without the help of an army would not have been difficult for the Lord. But later, when Scripture describes the exploits of David and his mighty men, a single-handed defeat of the Philistines at Baal Perazim is not mentioned. So it is likely that David had some kind of fighting force with him when he went out to face the Philistines. And yet, David gives full credit for the victory that day to the Lord. He says that the Lord broke through and broke down the Philistines just like a flash flood lays waste to anything in front of it. And this illustration is why he named the place Baal Perazim, which means the Lord of the breakthrough. Maybe it was merely the descriptive language of a skilled poet, or maybe the actual physical defeat of the Philistines appeared as though they were being mowed over as they would with the waters of a flood. And some of the Philistines do end up escaping the battle, probably in panicked retreat. We see in the inverse of 1 Samuel 4, when the Philistines captured the ark of the Lord from the Israelites, because here the Philistines flee so quickly and forcefully that they abandon their own idols. Maybe they thought that their gods could defend themselves, of which they should have remembered otherwise in their own religious history, because when the Philistines had captured the ark of the Lord and taken it to the temple of their gods, their idol collapsed and was dismembered before the ark. They should have known that the God of the Israelites was the real God. The reality of the situation presented itself as though they valued their lives far more than they valued their gods. Maybe deep down they knew that their gods were not real. So when push came to shove, abandoning the pinnacle of their religion was not a difficult decision, because they could simply create new idols to worship. Which, if you really think about it, is entirely backwards. We should worship the one who created us and not create one to worship. But the Philistines are so overwhelmed by the Israelites that they run for their lives before David, and David and his men took the idols from the battlefield. We're not told, but David's repeated faithfulness can only lead us to surmise that they destroyed the idols in some capacity. If another king had been leading the attack, then maybe the idols would have been kept. But David is only ever described religiously as being unflinchingly loyal to the Lord. So any implication that David might have kept the idols for himself or might have tolerated his men keeping the idols would seem to be completely off base. Verse 22. And the Philistines came up yet again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, "You shall not go up. Go around to their rear and come against them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then rouse yourself, for the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines." And David did as the Lord commanded him, and struck down the Philistines from Geba to Gezer. So, some unspecified amount of time later, the Philistines muster their troops again and come back to try to remove David. Now, the last time had been such a decisive victory, one cannot really understand why they would come back and try again. Maybe they spent some time trying to develop a new strategy or new battle tactics. Maybe they gathered even more troops or hired troops to try to defeat David with a possibly great fighting force than they had the last time. But for whatever reason, the Philistines have convinced themselves that they somehow can defeat David this time when they never had been able to do it before. So they bring their troops right back to the same place of their previous defeat, hoping that this time will be different. And David does the exact same thing as he did last time, because again, at this point in his reign, this was his habitual practice. David asked the Lord what he should do against the Philistines. It would seem to be a no-brainer for David to go out against the Philistines since the last time was so easy, but David knew that the last time was only as easy as it was because they had been empowered by the Lord in their work. And so attempting to go out in battle against the Philistines this time without the Lord would have been incredibly foolish. The Lord again tells David to fight the Philistines, but this time he is not supposed to lead his troops straight out for a direct attack against them. This time, the Lord lays out a very unique strategy for David to follow if he is to experience another victory. This is reminiscent of Joshua leading the Israelites to encircle Jericho for a week before attacking. David is to lead the Israelites out of the city and all the way around to the rear of the opposing army. David is seemingly meant to cut off the Philistine retreat so that this battle would not end in the same way as the last one. The Lord tells David to wait there opposite the Philistines until he hears what will sound like an army going to war coming from the tops of the balsam trees, not the bottom, the tops. So God used sounds of an army in another battle later on, in another Israelite victory in 2 Kings chapter 7, verse 6, where it was the sound of a great army, a great many chariots and horses. So David and his men are able to be victorious that day because they followed the direction of the Lord. And this is exactly how our lives should be lived even today. We are meant to seek the Lord first in every situation and every opportunity that arises in our lives, even if it seems like a no-brainer. We are meant to follow the Lord in every situation that we will face in this life. So to go out and face the day without first seeking the Lord and without following Him only invites foolishness and defeat. I hope you'll come back next week as we go a little bit further in the book of 2 Samuel, verse by verse, to see what occurs next through the life of David.